been working in Bolivia for 10 years. So I did my PhD research on Bolivia. So in my presentation, I'm going to pick up on some of the debates that we've had with Daniel Chavez in terms of the limits of extractivism. Dave McDonald in the keynote address was also talking about how one of the really fascinating things about working in Bolivia is about how everyone hates the state. And you know, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with the state too, so that's going to come through in the presentation. And also to acknowledge that there's two important people who were not able to be with us today because being in Bolivia, being from Bolivia, being Bolivian is very complicated, including trying to get out of Bolivia or convincing other countries to let you out of their country. So Marcela Oliveira could not be with us. She's another steering committee member, and she's an important activist and organizer with the Red Vida, which is Latin America's largest anti-privatization network. And also another colleague who I've worked with in Bolivia for a number of years, Rocio Bustamante, who has a wonderful paper, which is in Spanish, which discusses the debate about what we mean by the commons, or differentiating the commons. Some of the comments that I'm going to make about the demands of the Bolivian social movements touch on some aspects of her paper, but I will not summarize it for you here because we're all trying to say everything in 15 minutes. Oh, where's my map? Oh, there's my map. So this is Bolivia, and there's two things I want to say about Bolivia. It's a country that lacks in everything but territory and imagination, according to one of my favorite historians of Bolivia. And it's very important to point out, I'm looking for the, is that right? Okay, I'll just use my finger. Where it is, which is nestled in the middle of the Andes Mountains without access to the sea. By virtue of its geography, in part, two things about Bolivia are important. One is that it's a majority indigenous country, along with Guatemala, which is the other Latin American country which is majority indigenous. According to the census of 2001, 62% of Bolivians self-identified as indigenous. So I want to immediately flag a parallel with South Africa, which is majority black country. Bolivia is going through many of the tensions and transitions that have been experienced post-apartheid South Africa, which I will explain. The second one is that it's a mining country, and it's been inserted in international commodity markets since the 1500s. In fact, one of the major cities, or minor cities now, in Bolivia, Potosí, was at one time in the late 1700s larger than Paris. And so it has been inserted as a silver mining country, and so Bolivia has hit the news again because of the role of miners. If you know anything about working class formations in Latin America, you might also realize that they tend to be the most militant amongst workers for several reasons we can discuss. In Bolivia, the miners' organizations have been traditionally very Trotskyist, which means that there's a very, very alive discussion in terms of the relevance of Marxism, the relevance of revolution, anti-imperialism, but also how it intersects directly with indigenous forms of knowing and organizing, which makes a very rich debate in terms of the search for alternatives. So, the reason why Bolivia has been in the news recently is largely because of these two men. I'll only talk about one of them, our brother on the right, although they should be reversed if you're looking at ideological spectrum. Sorry, I didn't take the photo. So Evo Morales is the president of Bolivia. He took office, not power, office in Bolivia in 2006. He still remains the president of the Coca Growers Associations, called the Six Federations of the Tropico. He remains the president of the social movement organization of coca growers to this day. That is to say, there are direct links between social movement organizations and the state through that guy. And the guy on his right is sort of a mestizo broker who makes the middle class think that it might be okay to vote for this guy because he's indigenous, right? So they've done a lot of wonderful things since they've been in office, including taking back to the state the main productive apparatus of the economy. They've renationalized oil, for example, and so the Morales government is the first government in 20 years to have a surplus budget. How did they do it? They finally charged a royalty for gas. It's a country that has the second largest proven reserves of natural gas in Latin America. The corrupt white elites sold the country down the river, sold the resources for nothing, So a lot of what we're seeing in Bolivia happening today is a reclaiming of natural resources, which gives a lot of power to the movement. And I'm happy to answer any questions about reforms. But we are here to talk about water. And so I'm going to quickly summarize these for you. There's a paper if you want numbers, if you want details, please feel free to ask me. But what's changed in water? And the reason why water is important is because, as I will explain in a minute, one of the reasons that Bolivia is important in the international circles in terms of the water movement is that it's also the site of the Bolivian water wars, which some people claim is the first successful or the first victory against privatization, when the people of Cochabamba took to the streets in the thousands reclaiming water resources from Bechtel, which is an American company that had a consortium, had a privatization contract with running the water system. So after 6 months, they booted out cartel. So what has changed? The water sector, therefore, has been one of the case studies of what is the Morales government doing. It's a sector in which there's a high degree of public participation, there's a high degree of public knowledge because of this social movement history, the water wars, etc. So even before Morales was elected, the previous governments reversed the privatization contracts. There were 2 of them, the capital city, La Paz del Alto, also Cochabamba. So these contracts were reversed in 2005 in the capital city, and then 5 years previous in Cochabamba. Again, we can talk about the details if you'd like. The other thing that has changed is that because of this nationalist populist movement, this state has retaken its role as not just a regulator of services, but also as a direct provider of services. This is also concentrated now in the Constitution that was passed by popular referendum with majority vote in 2010. The Constitution of Bolivia also now recognizes the right to water as a human right. However, there's contradictions in the language. It's a very complicated document that some of the critics suggest has not exactly closed, for sure, the door on privatization, except for the fact that no multinational in its right mind is going to want to have a contract in Bolivia. So even if it's in your constitution, there's a capitalist strike against investing in the water sector in Bolivia, because you'd have to be insane to want to go back there. What has not changed, and this is one of the things that I think the Municipal Services Project has to contribute to the debate, is that rather than just looking at these administrative reforms, we need to be talking way more about how services are being produced and how services are being financed. So one of the things that I argue in the paper is that what has not changed at all is increased public investment to the extent that is required to meet the extent of the social need and the social demand in Bolivia. In fact, the Morales government is still relying on international donations to fund its expansion in the water and sanitation sector. Some of those donations come from Chavez. The most important program has been called Evo Cumple, or Evo meets his demands, or the president meets his demands. This program has been highly criticized by Bolivians for also being an electoralist strategy. For example, when you get your little pocket money as a municipal government, you're to have the works executed in like 6 months. Okay, if you're planning a drinking water and irrigation system in a community and do it well, you need way more than 6 months to do that work. And so there's a lot of criticisms of the way they've been trying to deliver services that I'm happy to answer questions to about. But really my point here is that the government talks a lot about buen vivir, living well, which is an Andean concept about the good life. Am I 5 minutes? Good. But there's a wide gap between rhetoric and reality in the Bolivian case. So this is the part where we all get sad. But let's talk about what's happy first. Which is, this is really what gives and I think this transition is really about where is the transition going. In the last session I was at, it was mentioned that apartheid, or the post-apartheid, is not an event, it's a process. And so it's about where are those social forces pushing to pull the government to the left. And so the wonderful thing about Bolivia is that militant, organized social movements of various tendencies And so a couple of slogans from the 2000 water war: what is ours and cannot be taken away. The water is ours, damn it. One of the things about Bolivia that's particular is that people have control over their own means of reproduction and subsistence. One of the problems with the privatization is that the private contract made it illegal, or you would have to pay for water from your own well. And of course, this pissed people off. It also means that there's a lot of traditions of self-organization at the community level. I'd like to quote Oscar Oliveira, one of my favorites, and also the brother of Marcela, and they still get along, so. That the true opposite of privatization is a social reappropriation of wealth by working class society. He goes on to say, in the trade unions, in the communities, and in the rank and file. So one of the things that I want to problematize in this presentation is whether the state market is truly a dichotomy. When we're talking about privatization, we're like, oh, the state's doing it. The work on corporatization that we've done talks about how complicated that relationship is. And if you're like me, you believe more or less that the state is some kind of reflection of what's happening in what may be called your base. What's going on in the economy will have some bearing on what kind of state you have. So we need to be talking way more about what does reappropriation mean. So this is what I'm going to end with. While Evo Morales was in Cochabamba at the Alternative Earth Summit, who here was at the Alternative Earth Summit? In Cochabamba in April 2010? We don't have anyone? No? Oh, Marianne, who's probably in another session. Oh yeah, she's next door. This was a huge global event, which was an alternative to the COP process of building a movement against climate change. So if you see here, April 19th, this is like a day before the opening proceedings, 2010. The Bolivians from the Ministry of Development Planning were in Washington with this slide, trying to convince the Americans to come and give them money. And so one of the things, and again, this is a depiction of their investment priorities of what they're going to spend their money from the national treasury. What I want you to notice in the slide, what's number 1? Mining. What's number 2? Hydrocarbons. What's number 3? Electrical energy. 4, transport, industrial production, housing. Water and basic sanitation, 1.2% of the national budget. More than 80% to industrial takeoff. Okay, so this is a country in a process which is about industrialization, which of course raises a lot of questions about the limits of the extractivist model, because of course that has a damaging effect on the ecology. And certainly it's not exactly what all of the social movements were fighting for. Here's a little map of what they mean by the development vision of Bolivia. And so what I want to close with is that, again, to quote Oscar Oliveira, the state markets might not be the only kind of dichotomy, or it isn't a dichotomy. We also need to be talking about how do we reclaim these spaces for collective organizing, collective reproduction, collective production. But to also mention that in the context of reforms, reforms are important. State reforms, we need to be talking about different forms of state. But the purpose in my political vision of reforms is really to raise capacity of the working classes themselves for reappropriation. And if we're going to talk about social democracy in its old term of the 20th century actually meant transition to something else. Libertarian traditions, anarchist and communist traditions, left and right parts of the spectrum don't really love the state. And the reason why is because our relationship with the state is an incredibly complicated one. And how do we build parties that actually represent the interests of the majority rather than a small minority, and hope that through industrial takeoff, the goods will trickle down to the people who really need it. So, thank you.